Passage 1. This passage is about the worst century ever, the disasters that have plagued the century. Let's quickly read and recap the passage so that we can answer the questions. Numerous centuries could vie for the unfortunate distinction of being the worst time to have lived. Take, for example, the 20th century with its two world wars, or the century following 536, when extreme weather events led to widespread famine thought to have been caused by a volcanic winter obscuring the sun. However, overall, it is the 14th century that can lay perhaps one of the strongest claims to have been one of the worst periods to have experienced, particularly in large parts of medieval Europe, due to a succession of devastating disasters which unfolded during this time. Lot of centuries will compete with each other to which is the worst, but according to the author, the 14th century was the worst. Why does he say that? So now we can anticipate that in the rest of the passage he's going to tell you how the 14th century was the worst of all the centuries, of all the periods in history, and especially in medieval Europe. In 1315, medieval warm period where crops had flourished and Europe's population was at an all-time high, the medieval warm period abruptly ended in 1315 and was followed by extremely heavy rainfall. Rain fell almost constantly throughout the summer and autumn of 1314 to 1316, meaning much of Europe suffered treacherous flooding along with a period of much colder than average temperature. So this is what happened in 1315. The warm period came to an end. There was endless rainfall, almost 2 years, resulted in flooding. All right, and colder than average temperatures. Next, the population had been growing quickly, but this bad weather led to widespread crop failures and subsequent severe food shortages. So the population had been growing till then because the weather was good, and this bad weather, this rains meant that there were crop failures, food shortage, basic food staples skyrocketed in price, and Europe's large population could not be sustained, resulting in the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317, where an estimated 5 to 12% of North Europe's populations died as a result. The situation growing so bad, there was no food, that some resorted to cannibalism, eating human meat. 30 years after Europe's recovery from the Great Famine, so this was 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine happened. Then 30 years later, another disaster struck. What was that? The most infamous catastrophe of the 14th century occurred with the bubonic plague known as the Black Death, and this struck them in 1347. The plague is estimated to have killed at least 25 million people in Europe, causing population declines between 30 to 50% in Europe. Some estimates suggest that even 200 million were killed, making it the deadliest pandemic in history. The Black Death, this is one part, people being killed. The Black Death had a devastating effect on the Catholic Church. Even church officials died. Not only from the failure of prayer to prevent sickness and death, but also priesthood supporting disproportionate deaths from the disease due to the frontline roles in attending to the dying and in providing what little palliative care there was. One, the church was affected because people realized prayer didn't help in preventing the plague or preventing deaths from the plague. The second thing, lot of the priests died because they tried to give some kind of palliative care, some kind of help to the sick and the dying. That is part of the, vows that they take. And in the process, the priests also got affected and died. Amid ongoing wars, the 14th century witnessed widespread popular revolts and civil wars among nobles. This crisis of the late Middle Ages resulted in part from the hardships of the Great Famine and Black Death. Having dealt with the challenges and instability of the first half of the 14th century, Europeans were stirred and angered, promoting a radical social system. So, the first half of the 14th century, there were weather challenges, there was a health pandemic, and there was instability. Because of that, Europeans were angry, and that led to a radical social shift. What kind of social shift happened? By the 1380s, the substantial population decline resulted in a severe labor shortage. Surviving peasants gained significant bargaining power. Now, the labor shortage was there. So, those workers who were surviving, they had an advantage, right? They had the bargaining power, commanding higher wages and the freedom to choose where they work based on pay and condition. So they could ask higher wages, they could also decide where they wanted to work. They had that freedom. For the first time, the balance of power was shifting in the direction of the poorest in society. Economic disputes and excessive taxation contributed to near anarchy, leading to organized peasant uprisings across northern Europe. Heavy taxation and economic conflict led to peasant uprisings across northern Europe. Nevertheless, it was these factors that also created excessive taxation and disputes caused peasant uprising, but the factors, the conditions were ripe, leading to the breakdown of feudalism and set the scene for peasants' revolt. This is the passage. It's all about the events that happened in the 14th century, the weather conditions, adverse weather conditions, and the famine, the bubonic plague, the subsequent, what happened after that, peasant uprising, right? And laborers, the balance of power shifting toward the poorest section, with the labor gaining an upper hand and the peasants' revolt happening. All right, let's look at the questions. Each of the following statements is not true except. So what does the question ask us to do? Find out which statement is correct. So there are 4 statements. All of them are not true except which one? Towards the end of the 14th century, the balance of power began shifting back, yes, to the landowners, no, to the poorest sections of society, right? So A is incorrect. The 14th century witnessed many disasters, but no major wars in medieval Europe. There were many disasters, and also the author says amongst ongoing wars. So there were wars, and here it says no wars. So this is also false. This is not our answer. Much of the 14th century experienced social stability. There was social instability. Peasant revolts at the end of the 14th century led to the abolition of feudalism. That's what the last sentence of the passage says. We remember it very well. Therefore, the correct answer is 4. D, right? Thank you. Question 2. In the context of the passage, which one of the following cannot be inferred with regard to the 14th century? 3 can be inferred. Which one cannot be inferred? We've read the passage and summarized it. We don't have to go back to the passage for this. I don't think we have to. The various major catastrophic events led to social progress. It did. It changed the balance of power towards the peasants, among other things. The early part of the 14th century saw a rise in population in medieval Europe. That was the period of the warm period. So there was a rise in population. After the famine and the plague and all, it came down. So this also can be inferred. Catholic priests died in large numbers during the plague. Yes, they did. One was because they tried to help the people who were affected. They tried to give them some sort of palliative care, and so the priesthood also saw a rising number of deaths. That's what the passage says. So C can be inferred. The famine due to excessive rains was the greatest catastrophe of the 14th century. The famine was a catastrophe, sure, but not the greatest. What does the author call the greatest catastrophe? The bubonic plague or the Black Death. Therefore, which one cannot be inferred? Option D cannot be inferred because it contradicts what the passage says. The passage calls the bubonic plague the greatest catastrophe of the 14th century. Therefore, D is my correct answer. Question 3. Which one of the following quotes best captures the main concern of the passage? So, he's given 4 statements from the passage. Which one captures the essence of the passage best? Numerous centuries could vie for the unfortunate distinction of being the worst time to have lived. Take, for example, the 20th century with its 2 world wars. Very specific, he says, there are numerous centuries that can vie for the worst. For example, so this, finally, what was the author's main point? There are numerous centuries that say they are the worst, but the worst was the 14th century, and then he tells us the reasons why it was. So this is not the main point. Basic food staples skyrocketed in price. Europe's large population could not be. This is about the result of the famine. However, overall, it is the 14th century that can lay perhaps one of the strongest claims to have been the worst periods to have experienced, particularly in larger parts of medieval Europe. That's my main point. Alright, this is about the effect of the changes of the famine. Therefore, the quote that summarizes the main point best is C. Which one of the following sets of words or phrases best encapsulates the issues discussed in the passage? Think of the logical flow of the passage. First paragraph, there were many centuries that can compete for the worst. For example, the 20th with its wars. Second, but it was the 14th that was the worst. Why was the 14th the worst? First, the bad weather, the rain, the great famine. Second, the bubonic plague. As a result of this, many people died. Labor was in an advantage. Balance of power was shifting towards the poorest sections and the peasant uprising. Correct? 20th century, well, this is only an example, not a main point. Right? Decrease in population was due to the plague. This is not, doesn't give us the main point. You have to mention the plague and then say that decrease. So this is not. 14th century, yes. Famine, yes. Plague, yes. Peasant revolts, yes. Therefore, my correct answer is option B.